mandated labeling. That means that 60% of the world's population has a right that we don't have here in the land of the free. That's just interesting to note. Almost 2/3 of the world, but not here. And as you see the various countries that have passed over time, you'll see that the numbers keep on growing and growing and growing. And in many cases, these are countries that actually ban GE. And again, this labeling effort is not calling for banning. By now, the genie is out of the bottle. We're not putting it back in. Next slide, please. Let's click to the next one, please. So, sorry for the poor copy here, but what I wanted to underscore, and I said this earlier, is this is not a skull and crossbones. And again, that was represented in the editorial in the paper that one of the senators opposing this bill said, well, it puts a skull and crossbones. What we're talking about is putting something in the ingredients label along with all the other stuff that we don't understand. But truthfully, the point is that this is not something we're emblazoning on the front. Now, I want to be fair and I want to be honor the debate. For sure, in Washington State, the referendum that just went down barely after being outspent 10-1, they were calling for it on the front of the label. And I will say that Just Label It was not supportive of that. We believed that just simple connection does contain or may contain, as by the way is the standard in 64 nations around the world, is what's necessary. So we're not advocating a skull and crossbones approach. Now, why label? So our constituents, again, I mentioned before this long, varied list of the kinds of parties that are with us. We have constituents who, like any coalition, don't agree on anything other than transparency. We have religious, ethical, moral, medical, free speech reasons. We have members of our coalition who are evangelical Christians who call GMO God moving over. They don't like messing with God's work. And then we have scientists and farmers and weed scientists and unions and farm workers. And again, it's just broad constituency because what we agree on is very fundamental. That we should be able to choose. What should be so complicated about that? And in fact, research conducted by the Mellman Polling Organization last March, and again, if you saw the Sentinel editorial today, you saw a reference, showed that 92% of consumers want the right to know. It was interesting when the Mellman poll came out, they first paused at the beginning to say 92% of Americans don't agree on anything. So they found this completely unprecedented. But there was no statistical difference between men, women, Republicans, Democrats, independents, urban, rural, or age. And as a matter of fact, we went ahead and conducted that poll here in New Hampshire earlier this fall. Came up with the same exact number. 92% of New Hampshireites, when given the choice, say, yeah, we'd like the right to know. Now, here's what I believe is explicitly material. And again, I want to just underscore. We're not saying it's about the safety of genetic engineering itself, because again, I don't think you can. We can all have our opinions and our debates, and certainly there's studies that suggest that a lot more research is needed, but we just don't have that data. But there are some arguments here that are not assailable, that are not up for debate, that I believe are highly material. And it really goes to specifically the most prevalent trait that has been introduced into these crops, and that's for herbicide tolerance. I mentioned the 2,4-D tolerance a couple minutes ago. The primary genes that have been introduced into genetically engineered crops, just to be clear, have enabled either increased insecticide or herbicide resistance. The chemical company patent holders had promised back in the 90s, as these crops were coming up for approval, that these crops would lead to reduced usage of these agrochemicals. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, for example, one of the very first GE crops that was introduced in the commercial marketplace for human consumption was an herbicide-tolerant corn with an insecticide built into its DNA. In the first 15 years, insecticide spraying, and specifically to prevent corn and cotton insects, actually did decrease, as you see here, by 123 million pounds. So this was, in fact, a promise that was made by the biotech companies that actually has been fulfilled. The problem is that it was fulfilled because instead of spraying now, we're putting the insecticide in our food. And actually, a secondary promise that was made was that the Bt toxin, which by the way is a very effective and when used in small doses, it's even approvable under organic standards, but it was suggested or stipulated that based on prior research, that when you ingested this corn, it would actually break down in your saliva, let alone in your digestive system, and there would never be any insecticide buildup in your bodies. Well, a very worrisome paper came out 2 years ago that showed, here in Canada, just north of us, that in fact the insecticide was showing up in the cord blood of pregnant women. And in fact, we now know that across this country, Bt toxins are present in our tissue, that there was no salival breakdown, and this was one of these broken promises. The other thing, if you could click again, about this is that it was promised that this would, of course, help to control the corn rootworm. Can you just click one more? I think there's one more time, please. Thanks. So now what we have, again, is we have a situation where we have the corn rootworms are now actually developing resistance, because what has happened is we've taken an insecticide that was very effective in small doses and used occasionally. But when we overuse it, in nature, the bugs don't wait around to do focus groups like humans, right? They just basically using too much of a good thing, sets the stage for obsolescence and disappointment. Mother Nature is basically working 24/7 to always find a way to adapt, and that's what's happened here now. We have these corn rootworms that literally are no longer being controlled by this formerly effective and useful agent. So again, let's go to the next slide. So as you follow this sort of story along here, as I mentioned, again, the other unbroken promise is that this insecticide has now been detected in the umbilical cord blood of pregnant women. Let's go to the next one. So again, to be fair, and click one more time, it'll bring the graphic up, thank you. So again, with the insecticide, the two primary crops, one was the crop that introduced the insecticide into the corn. And again, it did result in less insecticide use, but that's because, again, we're consuming it. And again, you have these promises that were made that, lo and behold, over time we find out didn't quite work out the way they were supposed to. Well, that becomes very severe when you look at herbicides. And this is what I want to show you here. The second major trait, as I mentioned, is for herbicide tolerance. That is, crops that can withstand herbicides so that a farmer can now place as much herbicide as they want, and the crop itself will not fail or be affected. Anybody in here who grows, or anybody who's been connected to a farming family, knows that historically, as a nation, we would use, you would apply herbicide just as common farm practice, just at the time when you put the seedlings in the ground, and that gave your soon-to-be seedlings, the sprouts, about a 2-week advantage over the weeds in the area. So what would happen is you'd put your seeds in the ground, you'd put your herbicide down, it would kill off the weeds, and that way when the first shoots came up, they weren't being competed. But what has happened is, and again, the prediction was we're going to use a lot less herbicide because of this herbicide-tolerant corn. And this, by the way, the herbicide we're talking about here is glyphosate, which you and I would know as Roundup. What happened is that the exact opposite, because farmers now found that they could use the herbicide at will, because again, it didn't damage the crops, you saw this absolute explosion. And not only has it been an explosion, but the numbers keep going up and up and up. This, by the way, is USDA data. This is not, something that we contrived here. In 1996, the year that GE crops were introduced, about 14 million pounds of glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, were sprayed in the 3 major GE crops of corn, cotton, and soy, accounting for about 4% of total pesticide use. So that's 14 million pounds in 1996. In 2012, nearly 300 million pounds were sprayed in this country, and that's 3/4 of total pesticide use. So you've got the exact opposite, once again, of what we were told. Next slide, please. In fact, the U.S. Geological Survey has now reported that glyphosate is now a common component in 60 to 100% of air and rainwater samples in the Midwest during the spring and summer, with levels rising in many aquatic ecosystems. And this is what's been happening. Every one of these crops is now, we're seeing increased usage because, again, the crops themselves can handle it. Next slide, please. So what you have is that you've got literally folks in the Midwest are actually breathing this stuff. And of course, any of us downwind from the Midwest, i.e. all of us in this audience, are also getting this stuff ultimately. Now, again, can we say that the cumulative effects of breathing or drinking glyphosate are deleterious to our health? No, we don't know. But honestly, I don't know that any of us can say it's probably very good for us. The reality is, as a country, this is again one of these fundamental failures, which is why I think this labeling issue is much bigger than just GE or not. We do not measure the cumulative effects of herbicides or pesticides. We don't measure the synergistic effects. We have no idea what the results are of multiple of these compounds, and we're on an everyday basis exposed to something like 100,000 chemicals in our everyday life, from air fresheners to fire retardants to pesticides and herbicides. And we absolutely have no idea what the safe thresholds are for the very young at the time of maximum cell growth. So what you have here, and it really shouldn't be a surprise, because again, let's remember, the patent holders of these crops are chemical companies. They call themselves biotech, but they're chemical companies. And these crops have been primarily engineered not for any increased nutritional value or consumer benefit, but basically to make it easier to control certain insects and spray herbicides on growing crops, killing weeds, but obviously leaving the genetically transformed crops unharmed. Now, this is a real moneymaker for this industry, which of course charges a lot more for the seeds and then for the chemicals that are being used. And therefore, this is why ads like this, full-page ads like this, are able to be funded. Now, I would love to tell you that, I know you're saying, why did I come to spend my afternoon with the most depressing guy on earth, right? And I would love to tell you this is the end of the story, and I'm going to try to get to the end of the depressing part as soon as I can, but I need to tell you it goes a little bit further. Let's go to the next slide. There's now, because of the overuse of this technology, there's now 28 weeds in this country known as superweeds that are a direct result of overuse, just like with the corn rootworm. These are emerging at an alarming rate. They're now present in some 50 to 75 million acres, where GE soy, corn, and cotton crops grow in more than half of our states. And several of these companies, these chemical companies, are now responding by designing GE seeds that will actually tolerate multiple herbicides. And so the ultimate caricature of that is the one I just mentioned. So what has happened, in fact, is that to combat weeds that have developed resistance to glyphosate, Roundup, and again, it's been a very effective herbicide, we're just overusing it now. Dow is now seeking approval of GE crops that are resistant to older, much more toxic herbicides like 2,4-D. And so what has happened is that if you're a farmer in the Midwest, and I've got many, many friends in this situation, and you're finding that these weeds are growing, and by the way, I was testifying on this in Arkansas, and a farmer got up and said, yeah, I got pigweed in my yard, it's 12 feet tall, it's the diameter of my wrist, and it'll stop my combine in its tracks. And in fact, he went on to talk about, he said, the only way that I can actually control this herbicide is with these weeds, or with a chainsaw or with machetes. So again, more labor costs and so forth. And that's why we've got many, many weed scientists on our coalition saying, wait a second, there's a problem here. But what you actually get, if you're one of these farmers and you're finding that you're getting these resistant weeds, you're now getting a prescription, which is to mix in a 10% solution of 2,4-D into your overall herbicide mix, which is exactly why we're now developing 2,4-D resistant crops. So what you have here is, again, the same sort of thing that we've seen with nuclear proliferation, only this is a chemical proliferation. We're overusing these chemicals, too much of a good thing, like I said, from the point of view of the farmer. And so you're building this resistance. You now need stronger and stronger chemicals, therefore you're building more and more resistance. And it's clearly only a one-way path. I mean, this is not debatable. It's not something that, a school child can understand this. If you use more and you build resistance, you're going to need more. And so at this point, the projections for these trends to keep on growing are something that there's very little debate. And when I do debate biotech companies, the chemical companies, they do concede that this is what they call a management problem. But it's a pretty fundamental problem. And what I would say to you and me, back to my point about FDA, is this is material. The fact that we have no idea what the synergistic impacts are, the cumulative impacts, that we have no idea what this is doing to us, especially to our very young, I would say to you that is highly material and well within the bounds of what the FDA ought to be regulating. And so therefore I would say to the state senators and anybody else who says there's no proof about safety, sure there's no proof about safety yet for the GE technology itself, but there's absolute proof, there's absolute reason to be concerned that we are sanctioning now a sort of a chemical inflation that is absolutely out of control. Now, one more slide, please. I should point out, I'm talking about toxicity to us, but it goes without saying that we're seeing all kinds of impacts, and if you see the journals, and I'm sure they're on your bedside from the American Weed Science Society, they talk about this stuff, that we are now killing off our pollinators. Herbicides don't just affect plants. A study just was released in November that showed higher soil compaction rates as a result of overusing herbicide, because we're killing off soil microfauna, the bugs and so forth, and therefore we're not getting the pathways, and we're getting more compacted soils. So again, this is a complicated issue. I'm sorry for the depressing stuff, but I think this is why we need to just, as a society and as a state, but certainly as a country, we need to have a very real conversation. Do we want to have an out-of-control situation where citizens have absolutely no right whatsoever to choose whether or not to support this kind of chemical inflation or not? And again, the other side, and you'll see ads like this, scare tactics, where they talk about, studies that show it's going to raise our food prices. I got to tell you, I do know a little bit something about food prices from 30 years in the business, and there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that the use of labels is going to increase food prices. And by the way, we have 64 nations worth of evidence to prove that. And so this is just absolute lies. I got to just be blunt with you. This is an absolute piece of BS here. But I've seen it again and again and again. And if you haven't seen the ad, take a look at who's signed off on it. I don't tend to see any citizens here whatsoever.